Good morning, everyone. It's what, Thursday? My name's Nate Bomberg. You know the deal. Today I'm getting on to talk about the bullshit that's been going on, the unintended consequences, and the end game. We're all aware of the big policy change that happened in Texas, where there was some legislation that was passed that allowed for some changes in abortion policy, which could affect Roe v. Wade. I'm not an expert on all this stuff, so I'm just going to wax poetic on it. So I'm going to kind of follow my old pattern of three things. I'm going to talk about three things today. And I'm definitely annoyed, and so I was going to wait and put a little bit more time into this, but I figured I'd just let the emotion flow a little bit. So we're going to talk about the unintended consequence. I'm going to talk a little bit what I know about the latest abortion, legislation that happened in Texas. And then I want to talk about, I'm just going to take some logical leaps, and I'm going to walk into some unintended consequences. And again, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a legal expert, but I'm just giving my strongly asserted opinion on this bullshit that I think is happening in Texas. And then I'm going to follow up with the last point being the end game. So talk about the law, logical leaps, and then talk about the end game. And this all kind of falls under this umbrella of unintended consequence. And, it's this thing that I've talked about this in, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but I've talked about this in prior rants about how when things are left in the dark, when society pushes things down and hides these things, they fester and they grow and they get nasty and they get disgusting. And so, for instance, the example that I like to use is the drug war. We've kind of pushed that to the fringes, and now we have this, we have people that are stigmatized, that are losing family, losing lives, and it's become a big issue because we kind of keep it in the dark. Now, of course, when the opioid, whole pandemic came about, of course, now it's endangering a lot of white folks, so we started to talk more about it. And I hate to say that, but I mean, the crack wars and the coke wars, nothing. Heroin, nothing. Streets. Now we've got opiates that are funneling into the rich kids, and rich kids are dying. And so now it's much more of a topic. Let's just be honest. But I say that because those things are pushed out to the fringe. And if we don't make things, for instance, prostitution in Nevada is legal. And that means that these people are getting tested. They're regulated. There's a level of safety that's provided for these sex workers because they've legalized it. They've not said, hey, you got to do this in the shadows. And so I'm a firm believer that things and even the dark stuff that we don't like to talk about needs to be talked about and brought into the light so that we can figure out how to solve these problems. Okay? Now, it's a lot of context for what I'm going to get into today. And I'm going to try to drop less F-bombs because I saw my mom signed up or liked it, and so I'm a little bit nervous. Hi, Mom. But no, for real, it did make me nervous for about 30 seconds. But the truth is that these unintended consequences and how we don't think about these meta level things that can happen from this stuff, and also because we push things into the dark, this is what happens, and you have these really awful nightmarish stories of people, we have Skid Row in California. We have Skid Rows all over America because we've kind of left homelessness be this dark, dirty thing that happens to bad people. Instead of bringing it out in the light and saying, hey, look, this is our problem. This is everyone's problem. Let's solve it. Let's regulate it. I mean, it's weird as that sounds. Let's figure out how to get these people homes. So the larger picture I'm trying to paint is that keeping things in the dark and pushing them out and making them illegal or making them hard to access, even if they're things that are social faux pas, whatever it may be, because society changes their beliefs and what's acceptable and what's not over time. We know that. I mean, ankles were fucking illegal. You couldn't walk around with your ankles out at one point. And so that could have been a sexual thing that they could have legislated against. And so we'd never have fucking miniskirts. But anyway, the point is that I firmly believe that this stuff has to be brought out, and you have to find legal means because people in a mass population, people are going to do what they're going to do. We had 70 fucking 5 million people vote for a clown. They're going to do dumb shit. Okay, so we can't sit here and say we're going to legislate morality and legislate everything everyone's going to do. We can provide guidelines. We can obviously have punishment and incentivize certain behavior. And that's what I'm talking about with this whole abortion thing. It's so fucked up because it harkens back to a time when people were using, ill-conceived methods to provide services to themselves or others that were killing people. And of course, there was a stigmatism that went along with, pregnancy outside of marriage, and that's waned a little bit, but in certain communities it hasn't. And so you still have that stigma of, hey, somebody got pregnant, we need to deal with this, and we don't have a legal means to do it. And so people are innovative. They figure it out, and people are fucking eating horse paste dewormer right now. When left to their own devices, people are going to figure out a dumb fucking way to hurt themselves to accomplish whatever goal they have in their mind. And so, and I'm not suggesting that somebody wanting an abortion is analogous to somebody taking dewormer, okay? What I'm suggesting is that when people are left to their own devices to solve a problem, and there's not a safe means to do that, if they really have to solve that problem, they're going to do whatever it takes, and sometimes they're going to make ill-informed decisions. And those ill-informed decisions can lead to death. And so what we're seeing right now in Texas is they've essentially said, and I'll get into the difference between, there's always, let me just back up. The Republicans and the conservative movement, the pro-life movement, has done a good job of kind of packing the courts and getting this, looking at the whole system, saying how can we get this Roe v. Wade legislation or this statute, this law, how can we reverse this and prevent people from having abortions? That's their motive, right? We can talk about why that's motive's short-sighted and weird. It doesn't even hit it doesn't even touch on some of those topics, but that's a whole fucking other thing. The Texas law is such that typically what happens is, let me just back up. So these conservatives have done a good job of kind of motivating and looking at the system and figuring out how they can get things through. And so what typically happens is there'll be a challenge, and then they'll challenge an abortion clinic or an abortion provider, and then the abortion provider will sue the state because the state, because of Roe v. Wade, essentially created some state protections that the state couldn't put undue burden on somebody to get an abortion. And that included providers and everyone else. And so the providers would then countersue and say, look, we're going to sue the state, and the state's going to then be liable for any kind of issues or liability that would come from that ruling. And so oftentimes the state would back down. So what Republicans and conservatives, pro-lifers have done in Texas is they found a very, very clever way around this by saying, hey, look, no longer can the abortion provider just sue the state. The burden is on the people. So people can now sue. So if your neighbor is getting an abortion and you found out they're 7 weeks pregnant and they're going to get an abortion, you now can report that. And I think there's even a $10,000 reward. Somebody fucking put a comment, if anybody's watching this, let me know if that's true or not, because I did some cursory research. But so essentially there's a bounty. So now you're looking at your neighbor, you're looking at everyone else, and especially if you're in a community where that's frowned, premarital sex is frowned upon for whatever reason, or having a baby out of wedlock is frowned upon. Now all of a sudden there's a stigmatism that goes along with it and a bounty. And so instead of the abortion provider no longer can sue a citizen, they have to sit back and wait to get sued. So essentially it took the power out of the abortion clinic by saying, look, you can do what you want to do, but now we're going to allow other citizens to kind of have the ability to sue you, and then you can't just reach out and do a protection suit, say, I'm going to do a clause that says I'm protected from every citizen. So it really opens the Pandora's box, or opens the gates, the floodgates, to lawsuits coming from any entity in that state. And so it's a very clever way of getting around this constant blockade for reversing Roe v. Wade by essentially saying, all right, no longer can the abortion clinic doesn't have any power to sue the state. The state isn't creating any undue burden. The citizens now have this right to. So Roe v. Wade, is kind of declawed. And by that I mean it still has that same statute that maybe the abortion clinic can't come after the state, but now individuals have the ability. Again, listen, I'm not a fucking lawyer. I read this shit. So if there's somebody that has some legal analysis that's better than that, that's fine. I'll take it. But my understanding is that that's what can happen, or that's what, and I talked about the $10,000 bounty and the stigmatism. Those, that kind of leads me in my next point, which is these logical leaps that you can take with this stuff. And when I posted this to do this live, one of the things I two questions I think of when a policy is implemented or it makes a drastic changes. All right, what is the end game of this policy? First of all, what are the unintended consequences of this policy? And, what's utopia look like? You have to ask, what's the end game look like? What's the ultimate goal? You now get a magic wand. You can paint your picture. What's that look like? And so you ask those questions, and sometimes you get scary answers. Sometimes you get fucking Orwellian answers, okay? Even for the policies that you think are correct. And so it helps to shape kind of how I come up with these different viewpoints. And I'm straight up being serious. It still rides above my mantra, which is government should only serve as an entity that protects the life, liberty, and happiness of its citizens. No more, no less, and should not be owned by any other entity. And that all that stuff is kind of falls into this whole manifesto declaration that I've been talking about. But kind of getting back to the point of this unintended consequences. So now you have, when I painted that picture in the beginning of the context that I'm talking about when I say these things are kept in the dark ages, or these dark fringes, and then they fester and things happen, and you can't know what's going on. You don't know what the STD rates are if you have, if people are just out there having, unprotected sex with sex workers, and it's promulgate, it's proliferating. And so now it's all in the dark and we don't know. And so now you've got this disease and fester. I mean, so legalized prostitution makes complete sense because you now have registered sex workers that have to get checked and everything else. So it's a whole health issue. You might not like it. You might not approve of it. But if we're going to have it, we want to make sure that the society's protected, because guess what? STDs spread and everything else and all the other things that can happen. So a safe environment for people to get their groove on makes sense. The same thing goes for this abortion issue, which is that it harkens back to those dark ages. And so you have these unintended consequences, which I kind of hinted on. And I posted something in my feed, just, the ominous picture of a hanger is disgusting and horrible, and it's graphic, but it harkens back to a day when that was an option. That was an option. Okay, everyone, I mean, it's just it's disgusting, but that's what can happen when people are left to their own devices. And so why would you want a human being, your fellow brother and sister, to have to make that decision when they're already in the angst of? And by the way, I will not make the argument that, hey, there's certain situations where, we have to talk. Listen, it's a woman's choice between her and her doctor. If her doctor says, by the way, if you abort this fetus, you may have health issues, so you're going to have to go to term for whatever. We have to abort it later or do a late term abort for whatever reason. That's between them. I don't know when it's not. I'm not even going to argue in case of rape. I'm saying, like, it is so bizarre to me to think that I'm going to tell. I mean, it's like, we're treating women like we're, like they're dogs, essentially, saying, hey, look, we're going to decide whether you can have or go to term, and we're controlling their reproductive rights. It's really bizarre. And that's another unintended consequence where I want to kind of take these illogical leaps where it's like, all right, so now you've said that women have to go 6 weeks before they hear a heartbeat. I mean, what's to say in future we realize that there's life, there's some kind of vibration that happens between cells when they're first proliferating, and now we say, look, we've got to go back 6 weeks. We've got to actually go. I mean, why not just go fucking insemination and just say, you know what? You can't jerk off anymore because you can't masturbate. You can't do those things. You have to make sure you capture your eggs. Every single period matters. I mean, why not just keep going and saying we can regulate everything at that point, and we essentially look to the government to decide when we can procreate. And by the way, there's a whole series on this fucking horrible dystopia that I'm painting, and it's The Handmaid's Tale. It talks about, like, all right, what happens now if your reproductive rights are no longer under your, now all of a sudden you have forced rape, essentially, because people are saying, look, we need children in the world. The government issued a policy. I mean, China's done this with their one-child policy, which is effective as it was. You know, there's a lot of questions about, all right, is that, I mean, United States, we looked on that policy like it was crazy, but now we're sitting here saying, look, we now can control your term. And you think that's different, but I'm suggesting that the unintended consequences of this, besides the hangers in the alley and all the other stuff that can happen if you can't get out of Texas to get an abortion, is that you're now laying the pathwork for all the government intervention they want inside your body for whatever reason. Because let's say for whatever reason we have another pandemic and for hospitals are overflowing, and so we can't have people having children. Okay? And so now the government say, well, you know what, we can just say you can't, there's no insemination on Thursdays or whatever. I mean, why not? Why can't we just keep going with it and say, all right, gun manufacturers, somebody got shot in my neighborhood. I have now PTSD. I'm suing you. And so now I can form a lawsuit against you. Look, I had nothing to, sorry, I've got something in my eye here. I have nothing to do with the issue. But now I'm able to sue gun manufacturers, which is fine, right? So you guys are okay with that. So I think that pharmaceuticals is another one where we can just open the floodgates to the unintended consequences of this law and say, look, you did all these opiate deaths, and anytime there's a death from medicine, I struggle because now I don't know what I'm going to take for my body. So I'm going to sue pharmaceutical companies for this and make it easy. So make it really easy. And now instead of me having to pay, I get rewarded for doing this stuff, by the way. So if I sue a manufacturer or I call out some violation of a gun law that passed, and I want to sue now that distributor or whatever, imagine being incentivized $10,000 to do that. So it's no longer like, all right, well, I'm not going to pony up the money. I mean, I'm getting rewarded. So the incentive that I talked about, the incentives at the very beginning, which I threw in there, the incentives of how we incentivize and punish affects the unintended consequences of this as well. And so what you have with this new law is you have them saying, look, you don't have to just pony up the money to go to trial. We'll reward you with the money that's needed for the violation. And then, so now you've got, abortion women bounty hunters? Is that a fucking show on TMC we're going to see? Like chasing women to make sure they're not aborting after 6 weeks and then walking around with fucking like a whole scanner system to see whether they're at 6 weeks. They don't even know if they're pregnant sometimes at 6 weeks. And by the way, I know I'm way out of my element talking about abortion and women's health. I don't know what I'm talking about. All I do know is that it's so fucking weird that we don't look at history and look at the unintended consequences of what happened when we had these stigmas, when we had these policies back in the day. And now we're doing it again. We're going backwards. Conservatives want to maintain the status quo, or do they want to fucking take us back to the dark ages? For real. I'm being serious when I say this, because if you're not a woman and you don't understand what it's like to have the stigma of getting pregnant before your wedlock and live in that environment and all that pressure and know that you've got to, all these life changes are going to happen. Maybe it's not that way. Maybe you just decided you're a professional woman and you don't want to have a child. And that's your prerogative to make a decision. Obviously, we can argue all day long that maybe we should have better contraceptive policies and all these other things that would prevent that. But in the case of a woman and her health, I got to step away and say, you know what? That's between y'all. That's between your doctor and you. And that's so fucking plain and simple to me. I can't imagine every time I do something physical, I'd have to go through the fucking government to think about it. I mean, it's really odd. And now all of a sudden my neighbors are watching. What if we have a no jerk off policy? Now my neighbors are going to be peeping in to see when people, I mean, it's insane. I'm using those fucking terms to make sure you understand how ridiculous this law is, because it essentially takes the power out of the provider, loses the protections that they had. They're no longer bound by the state. And now private citizens are essentially deputized to come after after the women. And the women, the whole thing's, in the excerpts for the law, they talk about, well, it's not really targeted at the women, it's targeted at the providers. It's the women. The women are going to be suffering. If they want to do something and they're not able to do it now there's questions, there's uncertainty. By the way, the reason why this is all coming about is because it was enacted in September. He signed it back in July, I believe, and it was enacted in September. So, people should have been screaming. People were screaming about this, by the way. Of course, you have all the other fucking distractions that are happening. But, so the first thing I want to do, I kind of gave you a little bit of overview of my understanding of the law. And of course, for conservatives, this is a win. I get it. And that's why I'm frustrated, because have you thought about the fucking end game? Have you thought about the unintended consequences? Or do you care? Because there's going to be unintended consequences from this policy that you may or may not be aware of. And so what you have to ask is, are the unintended consequences of this policy worth the risk? Worth the policy change? We've gone through history and says no. The best policy, the world essentially has come to the conclusion that, look, allowing women to choose their control their reproductive rights completely and their health decisions completely is the best thing for that society, for the women and everything else. It gives them freedom, gives them choice, and it provides a safe means for them to choose their destiny and how they want to reproduce and allow their body to reproduce, which is completely 100% their fucking prerogative. It just drives me nuts to think, like, if I was a woman and someone's like, yo, dude, you got to get the fuck out of it. There's no way, if that were the man's, the opposite, there's no way with the patriarch system we have, there's no fucking way that shit would be going through. Just no fucking way. I don't care how conservative you are. And, I don't like to talk about my family, but I have family that are, both sides. I have some family that are super advocates for this pro-life movement. And, I always want to say, okay, now let's say you get everything you want. You get everything. Now abortion is illegal. It's not happening anywhere. There's no more abortion clinics. Now what happens? What does that look like? Do we no longer have abortions? That's my first question. Have we stopped people from having abortions? No, we haven't. When you look at the whole population, no. People are going to have abortions still. They're going to find ways. So what we've done is we've pushed it in the shadows. What's the fucking utopia that you're looking for? What's the end game? Is it like now all of a sudden nobody has abortions, but you don't want to fucking change our healthcare system? For Christ's sake, you don't want to do anything after the kid's born. I know for a fact you do not want any entitlements. I mean, hell, if someone got pregnant before they're married and they can't get a job, they're useless to the capitalist society that we live in, right? So why the fuck would we give a fuck about them? But make sure they give birth. Make sure they give birth, and then we will not give a fuck about the kid anymore, I promise you. That's what the fuck world we're living in. And so this utopia that you talk about has to require other means if we're really going to have no abortions, which again would be a goal of mine as well. If we could have a world where we had no abortions, fine, because everyone now has complete control over the reproductive system, and impulse and all that stuff is taken away by, you can go you take a fresh drink of water, and next thing you know, hey, maybe we have male contraceptives where men take a pill. And we've created this system where no longer do we have to worry about men impregnating women without consent. So a man has to fucking consent. Maybe that's the system we need, is a man has to consent before they blow a nut in a woman. And then maybe we should have people monitoring that fucking transaction to make sure that there's no seed spilled and all this. I mean, as crazy and wacko as that sounds, and I know it's fucking, it's graphic, but where the fuck is your end game? When you come up with policies like this, what's your end game? Okay, when we talk about Medicare all, it's fucking simple to see my end game. Everyone's covered. Everyone lives a life where they're fucking happy and they're taken care of and their house covered. When it comes to homelessness, no one lives in the street. That's my fucking end game. These aren't fucking difficult policies. Well, equity, financial equity. Everyone gets an opportunity. That's the fucking end game. What is the end game with your abortion shit? What is it? Without supporting any other services that government can provide, what the fuck is the end game? It's so stupid. It's like, and this is why I get so frustrated, because like you can't have conversations like this with people online, because they'll send you a fucking picture of a baby, being cut up or some bullshit, trying to put that right in your face so you get to see the process. It's like, imagine going to get heart surgery, and right before the heart surgery, they like literally go through and they show you all the mistakes that can happen. They just fill you up with this fucking doubt. That's what one of the end games that conservatives have is like this education policy of, hey, before you go get an abortion, go see our politically aligned fucking counselor that will, make the whole experience horrible for you. So you're complete. And again, what are they using? Fear, fear, fear. So it's just bizarre to me that, when you have smart people, I think, I don't know though. I'm starting to kind of question what smart is and whether it's just complying or whether, and stupid sometimes, there can be intellectual incapacity, but sometimes smart isn't fucking smart. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD, just you went up through the system. Good job. Is that fucking necessarily smart? I don't know, man. That's a meta question, but my point is that there are smart people, educated people that make these decisions that don't think long term. They don't think about this. I mean, you're making public policy, you fucking moron. So you have to think at the macro level, not just my own personal beliefs. I mean, this is why we compare the American evangelicals to the Taliban, because you don't fucking think past your own goddamn self. Hey, maybe there's someone that thinks differently than me. No, I have to legislate. I actually had one of my friends who's an evangelical. He said, you have to legislate morality. You have to. And I was like, the fuck are you talking about? What is wrong with you guys that you guys have to, you can't just live without, you claim you want anarchy in some instances, but then you claim that you have to legislate morality. It's mind-blowing, but these smart people don't think about the consequences of their beliefs, and so they tie themselves to these beliefs and thinking, you know what, it's a graphic idea to think that someone's aborting a baby. They're killing a baby. They're killing some. It's not a baby, but they're killing a baby. Again, I'm paraphrasing their ideology here. And yet, so there's all this compassion for that, but yet there's fear that's created so that you have to be, just afraid of the whole process. That's the way they want to educate, is fear-based education. You're going to hell if you don't do these things. I mean, you guys continue to try to legislate what your religion is. And it's very similar to Sharia law to the people on the outside. It looks exactly the same. And so you're losing your message. You're losing your fucking message when you say you're pro-life and you don't give a fuck about the children that come out. You're losing your fucking message, Joel Osteen, when you shut down your fucking church and let everyone fucking just scramble. And then you're rolling around in jets and shit like that. You're just losing the whole thing. And so to us, it looks like a very graphic, like resource grab and a psychological game that's being played by some people. And that's what it seems like when we look at the Taliban. And that's why we compare it to a lot of folks that, you know what, I'm sure you find that offensive. I would, but prove me wrong. Tell me what your end game is. Is it where everybody gets taught that we have a perfect white history and there was no racism in this country? It was fucking honky-dory because we've gotten rid of race. I mean, there was 30 miles down the road, they banned a whole list of books. A whole list of books. I was saying at the end there that it frustrates me, the logical leaps that these people won't take. Instead, they focus on the short term and they don't look at the unintended consequences of these policies. This happens on both sides. You have to say, all right, on a macro level, what are we doing for society? And that's why freedom, this word that is thrown around by conservatives, is such a fucking bullshit word to use, when the truth is freedom would allow people to explore whatever they wanted to, as long as they weren't hurting somebody else, as long as they weren't hurting society, and they were doing it. And if it's something that does hurt a group of folks, but they consent to doing it, we find a safe and regulated way for them to do those things. That just makes sense, and that's true freedom. So yeah, you don't like drugs, but we need to make it a safe thing for people to do. If they want to do drugs, they can do drugs. They're going to do drugs. So let's make it legal and regulate it so we know what's going on with it. If you're going to have prostitution, make it legal. Regulate it. Make it safe for sex workers. It goes both ways. Also makes it safer for the consumers. And this isn't radical thinking, by the way. These are things that are being implemented all across the world. And so this notion that preventing women from making their own decisions on their own reproductive health is fucking batshit insane to me. It's going back to the dark ages. It's weird. And, unless there's a lot of religious beliefs, and obviously there's this debate about whether or not something is viable and whether or not, that's a whole nother argument that you can have, but it doesn't take away from the fact that this is still this woman's choice and it's her body. It's inside her. Just to me, it seems like you can't go and say, all right, that tumor right there, that's protected. We want to study that tumor, so it's protected. You can't remove it. I mean, I know a baby's not a tumor, but I mean, seriously, those are the leaps that you can make when you're saying that, hey, something inside me that I created is now yours to tell me what to do with? The fuck is that? So bizarre to me. And this is coming from the limited government people. But as I was going off on my last rant, I was trying to wrap it up by talking about this utopia. What is your utopia? What do you want what's your end game? When you think about the policies that you believe in, the things that you believe in, okay, gun rights. What's your end game with it? That everyone's strapped? I mean, what is the end game? Like, what's utopia look like for gun owners? Is it a certain select people have guns? Everyone can just buy and sell guns on the street? What is the fucking end game with your policy beliefs? Because if you just say, I believe in the Second Amendment, fuck you. Well, guess what? Nuclear arms, that's arms. So why can't I have a nuke? Like, some of those motherfuckers will argue that you should be able to have a tank and a nuke and all that shit. Maybe there's an argument for it. But my point is, like, what is your end game? Well, the end game of people wanting to maintain control over gun is, hey, look, you can do all your shit, but we want to make sure it's legal. We want to make sure you can't just mow people down. And if you do have a certain type of weapon, I would say there should be psychological testing. You should have to go to training like every 6 months. I mean, if you're going to have a weapon that can destroy massive amounts of people, I'm sorry, we got to check you every fucking couple days. We got to check you every 6 months to make sure you're okay. For real. Come on, people. This is a macro policy decision. I'm not thinking about the one-off. I'm not thinking about the massive group. I'm thinking about the one-off that's done all the things right and now has this weapon where they can kill people, whether it be brown or white. I know it's less impactful if it's white for you folks for some reason, but that's just the way I see it. Again, I know that was a little bit jab in your face, but I mean, I'm still kind of reeling over the fact that a bunch of white people rolled up on the Capitol building, and the guards even said it was white supremacists. A lot of white supremacy talk going on, and they just kind of marched in, and now you've got Congress people that are fighting for their freedom. So you can, if I'm a little bit jaded about the whole race thing right now, just fucking hang with me, because you're not in my shoes. Use a little empathy. But anyway, so listen, I'm going to try to split this back into the other thing, and I'm going to try to wrap with something strong. And I want to say this because it's very important. Every single time you think about something that you have a belief in, that's a policy effect or something to that effect, you should ask those questions. You should ask, all right, what is the end game, or what are the unintended consequences of this policy? Like, what can happen? Open your mind, because that's what people will do. They'll find the things that you don't. When you build software, there's always this notion that you're building it a certain way, and people will use it completely different than what you thought. I mean, Facebook is one example. Instagram started out just pictures. Amazon started out with just books, and now Instagram's got video and everything else. So there are unintended consequences when you put something out to the public, whether it be a policy or an object or whatever it is. People will find ways to skirt it, like the Republicans did. They found a creative way to figure out how they can skirt this Supreme Court law. So there's going to be creative lawyers doing this over and over and over. And so you have to think, okay, what are the unintended consequences of a creative legal team or a creative citizen for this policy? Is there ways to circumvent it? Is it going to cause more risk or harm than it is going to help? And the second thing that you need to think about is, what's the end game? What does utopia look like with this policy? Does this policy exist in utopia? Is this the right tact for us to get to utopia? And people want to say utopia, it seems like some people dream about dystopia, and other folks are literally dreaming about utopia. And the folks that dream about dystopia get so angry when people think about what it could be and all this utopian things. But here you are thinking about what it couldn't be. You're all this fear-based. Well, in case shit happens, I got to have my guns in case shit happens. So you're painting this dystopian picture of what your view is, but you're really mad because I'm painting a utopian view of what I think it could be. It's fucking bizarre. Again, the change you hope thing was problematic with Obama. Same context. Anyway, what's the end game? What's it going to look like? How does that and so when you start to think about that and look at things through that lens, you can look at Afghanistan and say, what the fuck? Why did we go in? That's why people were screaming when they went in. So you don't get to say, hey, guess what? There's all these consequences. These were the unintended consequences we talked about. Consequences. I know one of my friends loves when I make mistakes with words, so that was for you. Anyway, listen, I'm going to wrap. I'm going to try to split this up. I may or may not. I don't know. But I think I came in strong with it last one. And my points are that this policy is going to send people back to the dark ages. It's also benefiting the privileged. It's also going to, it also makes me think, like, what's the end game here? Why don't we care about anything else when it comes to women's health or even the survival of a child in this world? I mean, they're fucking having to go do fucking gun drills. Shooter drills. That's the environment we've created for your children. By the way, I have no kids. I have 2 pugs. Happy with it, but I still give a fuck because I feel like I'm part of this whole thing we call the human race. So anyway, look, I talked about if somebody has better legal analysis on the abortion law, definitely post it, send me it. My point today was really just the logical leaps that you can take when you start to think about these laws, and then it really leads to the question of what's the end game and what's the utopia look like? Start looking at laws like that. Start thinking about what the policies are. And if something really has no benefit for you, it's benefiting somebody. And they've got a long-term strategy they're thinking about. So you need to start thinking that way. Anyway, that's all I got.